Everyone, welcome to Base 10 Montessori. My name is Teresa, and today we're going to discuss chapter 16 of the Absorbent Mind. But first, before we do that, make sure to head on over to my YouTube channel and press the subscribe button. As you can see, I have 170 subscribers. My goal is to get to 200 by Christmas, so go ahead and subscribe, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to like, share, and comment on my videos, and that will help me out quite a bit. With that being said, let's go to chapter 16 of the Absorbent Mind. So chapter 16 is called From Unconscious Creator to Conscious Worker. And so we're really going to look at the two stages of development that happens in that 0 to 6-year-old age group. That first part, the 0 to 3-year-old, that is the creator stage of the first plane of development. And then the second part, that 3 to 6-year-old development, is the conscious worker. So we're going to discuss a lot of what happens during that time period and how those two periods are very different in that 6-year span. So in chapter 16, we're going to talk a lot about the spiritual embryo again. Now, we went over the spiritual embryo in chapter 7, so if you want to reread that, go back to chapter 7 and give yourself a reminder on what the spiritual embryo is. But don't worry, I am going to give some definitions during this video, so you won't be totally lost if you don't remember. So let's jump into chapter 16, which for me starts on page 147. She starts talking about that spiritual embryo. She starts talking about the unconscious creator. And she says, in this psychoembryonic period, various powers develop separately and independently of one another. For example, language, arm movements, and leg movements. Certain sensory powers also take shape. And this is what reminds us of the prenatal period, when the physical organs are developing each on its own account, regardless of the others. For in the psychoembryonic period, we see the mental powers of control coming into existence separately. And it is not surprising that we fail to recall what happens, for there is still no unity in the personality. This being a unity which can only be brought about when the parts are complete. And then she goes on to talk about how life begins again at the age of 3. And then she says, thus it happens at the age of 3, life seems to begin again. For now, consciousness shines forth in all its fullness and glory. Between these two periods, the unconscious period and the one which follows, there seems to be a well-marked boundary. In the first, there is no possibility of conscious memory. Only with the advent of consciousness do we have unity of the personality, and therefore the power to remember. Before 3, the functions are being created. After 3, they develop. So we have these two different periods going on. The first one we know a lot about. We know a lot about prenatal development. We know about the embryonic period. This is very normal for us, right? But the spiritual embryo was a whole new concept that Maria Montessori came up with, saying, okay, well, we have that physical development. We have that prenatal development. But there's got to be some other development going on here that takes all this creation that's happening and brings it together, that coordinates it. And so she termed this the spiritual embryo, this time in the child's life right after birth, where the child has all these organs that are developing and these mental organs as well as the physical organs, and we have to connect them. So she's talking about this connection. And when this connection happens, we are developing those mental organs, the organ for memory, the organ for reason. That's why you start to remember things at the age of 3, because those mental organs are connecting with the body in unison, in coordination. On page 148, she starts talking about a period of real constructiveness. And she says, what the child wants to do is master his environment, finding therein the means for his development. And what is it, to be exact, that he has to develop? It is all those powers which up till now he has been creating. So from the age of 3 till 6, being able now to tackle his environment deliberately and consciously, he begins a period of real constructiveness. The hidden powers he was previously creating are now able to show themselves, thanks to the opportunities for conscious experience, which he finds in the world about him. Such experience is not just play or a series of random activities, but it is work that he has to do in order to grow up. His hand, guided by his intelligence, begins to do jobs. It is as if the child, having absorbed the world by an unconscious kind of intelligence, now lays his hand to it. So let's discuss this real quick. So we're going to talk about the first plane of development. So for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with Montessori, the first plane of development is simply the 0 to 6-year-old age group. That's our first plane. Maria Montessori divided development up into 6-year planes. So the first year plane, we're going to have two different stages. We have the stage of creation, which is the 0 to 3-year-old age group. And then we have the stage of consolidation, which is the 3 to 6-year-old group. So in the stage of creation, in the first plane of development, it's this unconscious development. It's that period where the mental organs are connecting to the physical organs that are developing. Remember, in the prenatal development, the body is just being created. It's all being created. Nothing is cohesive. Nothing has come together. It really takes being born and using the organs to complete them. So we have this stage of creation in the first plane that's unconscious, where the child is absorbing everything around him. And then when we get to be about 3 years old, something different happens. The child is no longer creating the organs for movement, but he is refining them. He is no longer absorbing language unconsciously, but now he's constructing language and understanding how different parts of speech work together. He is no longer creating his senses, but now he's refining them. He has absorbed the world and he is now ready to put his experiences in order. And if you are familiar with Montessori, you know that I just talked about the different sensitive periods. So when we get to the stage of consolidation, we're really focusing on those sensitive periods that the child has already accomplished so much in these first 3 years that now he has to do something with it. He has to go out into the world and do something with all that he has created. And when we talk about this, when we talk about having that active experience with the world, there are a lot of things that become obstacles, and obstacles to development can be very tragic for a child in the first plane of development. Most of the time, the child is able to develop according to nature, and the greatest obstacle to that development is quite often adults. We're usually the ones keeping the child back from active experiences. We're usually the ones creating different sensorial experiences or lack thereof, right? So usually when we go to look at all these things, it's not created by the child, and it's not always created by nature either. A lot of the time, it is the decisions of the adults creating the obstacles for the child. Let's talk a little bit about constructive perfectionment. Montessori said the other kind of development consists in the perfecting of the acquisitions already made. Language is a very clear example, for its spontaneous development goes on till 5 or so. Already it has existed since the child was 2.5, and it was then complete. For the child could not only form words, but also use sentences grammatically correct. But there still remains a special sensitiveness that goes on urging the child to fix its sounds ever more accurately, and above all to enrich it with an even greater repertoire of words. Hence, there are two tendencies. One is the extension of consciousness by activities performed on the environment. The other is for the perfecting and enrichment of those powers already formed. These show us that the period from 3 to 6 is one of constructive perfectionment by means of activity. From ages 3 to 6, the mind's power to absorb tirelessly from the world is still there. But absorption is now helped and enriched by active experience. No longer is it a matter purely of the senses, but the hand also takes part. Whereas the child used to absorb by gazing at the world while people carried him about, now he shows an irresistible tendency to touch everything and to pause a while on separate things. He is continuously busy, happy, always doing something with his hands. His intelligence no longer develops merely by existing. It needs a world of things which provide him with motives for his activity. Let's break this down a little bit. So she's talking about the absorbent mind here. And if you are familiar with the absorbent mind, you know that it is like a sponge. And when she talks about the child's mind being like a sponge, what she means is that if you have a sponge and you have a bucket of clean water and you have a bucket of dirty water, if you take your sponge and you put it in the clean water, it will absorb the clean water, right? It's going to absorb anything that's around it. But if you put it into dirty water, it'll absorb clean water and it will also absorb the dirt, right? It cannot discriminate. You put the sponge in water, it will absorb whatever is there. It doesn't discriminate. It can't discriminate. And she says that's what the mind is like for these young children in that 0 to 6 age group. They have an absorbent mind. It comes to them easily. They absorb everything around them, but like a sponge, they can't discriminate. So we have to remember that the child is going to absorb everything around them, whether it's negative or positive. It's going to be made part of their world. So when we're talking about active experience, we need to remember that it affects a child on a profound level in a way that it's not going to affect an adult. This period in the child's life is one that is so unique that we have to keep in mind that whatever we put around them, they're going to absorb. And of course, we already talked a little bit about the sensitive periods, which is the language, order, refinement of movement, and refinement of the senses. So when we talk about those sensitive periods, what we really mean is that these are little windows into the child's development that we see where the child intensifies their interest. They intensify what they are doing in these areas. For example, the child will absorb language very easily. The child can absorb language in a way that he won't be able to do later on in life. So if you see a 3-year-old child learning 2 or 3 languages at a time and being proficient in it, that's the absorbent mind, right? There's a sensitive period for language in that 0 to 6 environment. And if we invest in that and enrich that during this time period, the child is going to retain it easily and they won't have to work as hard later on. But if we wait and introduce different languages or vocabulary, maybe bigger vocabulary later on, if we don't enrich the child's world with vocabulary in that 0 to 6 age group, later on in life, it's going to be a lot more difficult. They're going to have to work harder for it. That's not to say they can't learn. It's not to say that they won't learn. It just means it's going to be more difficult. But if we introduce these things during the 0 to 6 age group, they'll absorb it tirelessly. And the same thing goes for the refinement of movement. The child has this intrinsic need to perfect movement, to perfect those muscle movements. They've been developing those muscles. Now they need to perfect them. Same thing with refinement of the senses. So when we're talking about isolation of difficulty in development, what we're talking about is we're only introducing one difficulty at a time because we want the child to perfect one small skill at a time. So when you see a child pouring water from one pitcher to another, we're just going to do that over and over again, one difficulty at a time. Eventually, the child's going to be scrubbing a table or doing dishes or things that require pouring a pitcher into different types of containers. Maybe it's flower arranging and we have these tiny little vases and we've introduced all these challenges, right? All these extra steps. Eventually, those difficulties combine to become more challenging. But when we're talking about the child perfecting his movements, perfecting whatever it is that he wants to do, we're talking about introducing one difficulty at a time because that's the best way to help a child perfect whatever it is he's working on. We don't want to introduce 5 or 6 difficulties at a time. That's too much, right? We want to really narrow it down to perfecting one thing at a time. And the other thing we want to look at is repetition. Repetition is how we perfect ourselves. You cannot become perfect at something unless you repeat it. Very few people go out and do something and they've got it perfect the first time. So we have to repeat it. And that's why when we offer those activities like that one-to-one pouring, right? Just going back and forth and back and forth. And we'll have children in our classroom that will do that for a really long time. And they're perfecting that movement. They're perfecting that skill. They're perfecting that pincer grip. They're perfecting their concentration, right? All those things become perfected when we repeat them. And then, of course, we really want to talk about the point of interest, because when we're talking about perfection, there's got to be something about the work that calls to the child. There's got to be a point of interest. If there's not a point of interest, the child is never going to do the work. You might be able to force them into it once or twice, but if they don't have that intrinsic need to do it, that intrinsic calling, if you don't have that point of interest that calls to the child and gets them to repeat the work, it's just not gonna happen. And that's why we have so many different practical life works in the Montessori classroom, because we know that no two children are alike. We need to provide for all the different children in our classroom. And when one activity doesn't work for a child, we try to offer a different activity. So that point of interest in the activity is what calls to the child and encourages the child to focus and concentrate and then repeat the work. These are the fundamental ingredients for our practical life works in Montessori. And so when we're talking about this perfection, we really need to think about the absorbent mind. We need to think about sensitive periods. We need to think about the isolation of difficulty. What is it that the child needs to accomplish in this one work before they go on to other works that might combine difficulties? We need to think about repetition, and we need to think about that point of interest. What is that interest for the child? Is it bubbles? When they're scrubbing the table and they get all those bubbles on the table, that's a point of interest. So we have to think about what is that interest that's going to call to the child, and it's going to be different. It's going to be different depending on the child. Scrubbing a table, it doesn't interest everybody. So we have to think about different points of interest in different activities. On page 150, Maria Montessori goes on to talk about how the child prepares himself for the world. She says, but in those countries where the toy-making industry is less advanced, you will find children with quite different tastes. They are also calmer, more sensible, and happy. Their one idea is to take part in the activities going on about them. They are more like ordinary folk, using and handling the same things as the grown-ups. Though his action is imitative, it is selective and intelligent imitation, through which the child prepares himself to play his part in the world. In our Montessori schools, we give everything needed so that the child can imitate the actions he sees at his home. But we have implements specially made for him, of the right size to suit his diminutive proportions and strength. The room is dedicated to him, and he is free to move about in it, talk, and apply himself to intelligent and formative kinds of work. The social life which these children then came to lead brought out in them unexpected tendencies and tastes. It was the children themselves who showed that they preferred one another's company to dolls, and the small, real-life utensils to toys. So let's talk about this whole new world for children that Maria Montessori created, because she didn't just come up with a theory for child development, she tested it, right? This went through a scientific process for her, and not just in one area, in one classroom. She went around the entire world, and she saw these fascinating things occur in the classrooms that she visited. And the same things began to happen in every single classroom on every single continent that she went into, no matter what the religion, no matter what the language, no matter what that backdrop. She found that certain things were universally true. And the first thing that she's pointing out here is that we need to have a prepared environment. We need an environment that's attractive and child-size and real. That when we set up an environment that was attractive to the child, that was the same size as the child, that invited the child to walk around in it and be free in it and fit into the chairs and the table at their size, that something different happened. And she also noted that the children had opportunities to play with toys, and those experiences were short-lived. So when you're thinking about the different works in the Montessori classroom and why we don't have toys, she started out with toys. She started out with all those things. She started out with the baby dolls, but then she started to introduce real utensils, and something different happened again. The children were much more invested in the real work, in the real tools. And suddenly they weren't interested in the dolls. They weren't interested in the toys. They wanted to do what the grown-ups were doing. They wanted the real tools. And so she had to have all this new furniture made. She had to have tools that were appropriately sized for a child's hands. She realized through these experiences, through these real experiences, not just through theory, but through real experience, that no matter where she went in the world, these things remained true. And she realized that the children, when they had an opportunity to do real work instead of pretend play, they chose the real work. They chose the real opportunities based on the child's size, strength, and ability, right? We really want to have the work in the classroom match what the child is capable of and that next step forward, right? Now, I'm talking about this and you might be thinking, well, no duh, that's pretty obvious. We've been doing that for years in child development. But you have to remember that when Maria Montessori first came up with these ideas, it didn't exist. This idea that we could make furniture the same size as the children was a new concept at the time. So when she asked somebody to make furniture that was the child's size, this was a new concept for schools. This is not something that happened before. So as you're reading through this, just keep that in mind, that that was a new idea that for some reason nobody had come up with. So this was a whole new world of education that she was coming up with. And she said that social opportunities should be offered with real work instead of pretend play or fantasy play. Now, my background is early childhood education. And of course, there's a dramatic play area when you do childcare, right? That's a big part of early childhood education. And so it took me a long time when I started getting into Montessori to understand what was going on here. What about this is true? Because I wasn't quite understanding what she was saying at first. I was very skeptical, thinking, I don't know, dramatic play, fantasy play, this just seems like a staple of childhood. How can you deny it? It seems so unnatural. And I still think that there are outlets for that creativity, but what she is saying here is that something different is happening when we give them real work. What would it look like to take whatever it is that that child is feeling, to take whatever it is that that child is acting out through pretend and bring it to life? How could we make this a realistic opportunity for the child? Keep it in mind, it still needs to be appropriate, right? We still need to keep it very appropriate. But what if we brought that to life for the child? Instead of pretending to make food, we gave the child real opportunities to make food. What would that look like and how would the child respond? And what she's saying here is the child is empowered when we give them the opportunity to not just pretend, but to make real what's going through their minds. Remember, they've been absorbing all this stuff for 3 to 6 years now. It's time for them to get some active experience with it. That's what they're asking for when they're doing those fantasy plays and those pretend plays. A lot of the time, what they're trying to say is, I want to be empowered to do this, but I don't have the means or the opportunities. And we want to make sure that that child has the opportunity to use their hand for intelligent work and not pretend work or fantasy work. So here's the big secret. Toy companies don't want you to know that children prefer reality over fantasy. There's a lot of money at stake to keep children in a world of fantasy. So when you're thinking about fantasy, when you're thinking about pretend play, and you're thinking about what's healthy and what's true and what's not true, also keep in mind, where are you getting the ideas that the fantasy and the pretend play is good? Where are you getting your ideas that the child should be in a world that's not real? Is it based on scientific research? If so, that's great. Feel free to share that scientific research down below. But I also want to ask, is it from toy commercials? Is it from a movie? Is it from Disney, right? What investment do they have to keep your child in a fantasy world? And so when you think about, if you're trying to figure out what's true about this and what's false, think about, first of all, where the money is. Always look at where the money is. Who has what invested in fantasy play? And I'm not saying you shouldn't play dress up. I love dress up. I loved theater. I still dress up for Halloween. So I don't want to come down on this as though there's no place in the world for acting and theater and dress up, right? That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is, let's keep track of what is true as far as child development goes. Keep in mind what is true as far as what children need in their environment on a regular basis. Different age groups respond to fantasy and imagination in different ways. I also want you to keep in mind that when we're talking about the 0 to 6 environment, we need to think about how we are applying skills, developing the hand, developing different types of physical skills that can build something in reality. That we want the children to be creative, we want children to be imaginative, but not at the expense of skills, not at the expense of intelligent development, right? We want the child to creatively think about something in their mind and have the skills in their hands to bring it to life. And if you're constantly in pretend play and not building skills and not building up the physical necessities to bring about whatever creativity is going on inside your mind, then it becomes a deviation. And so what we're really looking for here is intelligent work, intelligent creativity, that you can bring something from your mind out into reality. And that's the creativity we're looking for. We're not looking at fantasy that leads to a separation from reality. When fantasy separates you from reality, there's a problem. But when you build up your skills, when you build up how you interact in reality, and then you have a creative thought later on, and you discover you have the physical ability to bring that creativity to life, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're empowering right here with creativity. The benefits of the prepared environment is that it increases concentration. It helps normalize the child. It helps put their world into order. It helps develop independence, and that independence creates confidence and skills. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a skills-based education. And yes, that can start in the first plane of development with those 0 to 6-year-old children. On page 151, Maria Montessori starts talking about the forgotten citizen. She says, alas, the child is forgotten in many more ways than this. And she's talking about real experiences. She says, he is the forgotten citizen who lives in a world where there is plenty of everything for everyone else, but nothing for him. In this empty world, he wanders aimlessly, getting constantly into mischief, breaking his toys, vainly seeking satisfaction for his spirit, while the adults fail completely to realize what are his real needs. Having given the child real things in a real world, we expected to see his joy and delight in using them. But actually, we saw more than that. The child's whole personality changed, and the first sign of this was an assertion of independence. No sooner was the child placed in this world of his own size than he took possession of it. Social life and the formation of character followed automatically. So what resulted was not just the child's happiness, but the child began his work of making a man. Happiness is not the whole aim of education. A man must be independent in his powers and character, able to work and assert his mastery over all that depends on him. This was the light in which childhood revealed itself to us, once consciousness had come to birth and begun to take control. So let's talk about this real quick. Let's talk about everything that we just read about right here. We have this real world that the child can exist in, and we can prepare this special environment for the child, an environment where they have freedom to move about in it. It's an area that's prepared specifically for him, specifically for that age group, specifically for his size. We filled it with all good choices. Everything in the room is filled with a good choice because it is an intelligent choice. It is an intelligent work. It's not something that separates the child from reality. Everything that the child is doing in this environment prepares his hand, prepares the body, prepares the mind for later work in life. So when we think about this and we think about the history of child development and how the child has been the forgotten citizen, the child was just around everybody who was functioning in the world, but not really part of it. We have to remember that we've come a long way when it comes to child development in all areas, right? We now make everything for the child's size, but we're still forgetting the child in a lot of different ways. In some ways, he's still a forgotten citizen. And I guess one of my questions I have for you today is, has modern society misunderstood how children develop or what makes them happy and why? And if you have an idea about that, if you've listened to this video and you're wondering that yourself, or you have an answer to that, leave that comment down below. I'd love to read it. I'd love to hear from you. So what improvements have we made since Montessori's time, right? She came up with this idea that we have to have this prepared environment for the child. And in a lot of ways, we have embraced that. But also, maybe there are some things that we haven't embraced yet. Or maybe there's some things we've understood and we've fallen away from. What regressions in understanding child development do you notice in modern society right now? Why? And how do big entertainment and toy companies brand happiness for children? How do they convince parents to buy into pretend play and fantasy play versus a real experience? Right? How do we embrace the idea of real experiences for children in this world, in modern society? I come from my background of childcare, where we are all about that fantasy play. And I have to question what I learned from my academic studies at a university, because it was all about fantasy play. It wasn't about active experiences. It wasn't about sensitive periods. It wasn't about this absorbent mind that took everything in around them. It wasn't about any of that. When I learned about child development through my university experience, right, from that academic experience, none of this stuff was being discussed. And we could have Barbie dolls, we could have toys, we had tons of toys. We didn't work with real food, we worked with plastic food. And now that I've worked in Montessori and I've seen toddlers cracking an egg to bake. Now, sometimes they cracked an egg like this and then it all just went into the baking mix, right? Sometimes that happens and it's gross, right? I get it. It's not going to be perfect, but we gave them real experiences. We even in the toddler room, we give them carrots to chop, pickles to chop. We give them bread to bake. We're doing all of these real experiences. We're not pretending to sew. We're actually giving them a thread and a needle at 2 years old and helping them sew. Maybe it's just 5 stitches, but they're doing it, right? In the primary environment, we're sewing little purses. We're sewing buttons. We're teaching them how to tie a knot. We're having real experiences. We have real glass. We have things that break. We're not afraid of breakable things in Montessori because those have consequences. That tells the child, well, maybe you need to be more careful next time. This broke, right? And now we can't use it anymore because it's broken. And when it breaks, there's a consequence of cleaning it up. Oh, did you spill all that water on the floor when you were doing your pouring work? Were you pouring it like this? Oh, it looks like you're going to have to get a towel and clean that up, right? So these real life experiences have consequences. They're not just interesting to the child. They don't just develop concentration better than the toys. but they teach a consequence, they teach a skill, they develop the body, they help the child develop in those sensitive periods of life. And when you think about that, when you think about this entire journey that we go on in Montessori versus something in childcare or even something in public school, I guess my question to you would be, are children who do real work happier than those with lots of toys and fantasy play? Because Maria Montessori argued that in societies that don't have all those toy companies, that don't have those advanced toy companies getting everything out there to them, she said they were more normalized, they were happier, they were calmer, they were part of society, they were included in the daily chores of the family. Their imitation of the adult was purposeful. It was intelligent. Maybe your argument is we can develop concentration through iPads. Yeah, they can stay focused and concentrate on that iPad for hours at a time, but is it intelligent, right? Does it contribute to society? Does it build a skill? Does it allow the child to have a thought in their mind that's really creative and give them the opportunity and the outlet to build that creativity in the real world? Or is it all in a virtual world? Is it all stuck inside their mind? So that's what we're talking about right here. What makes a child actually happy? Is it the iPad? Is it the toy company? Is it fantasy play? Is it dress up? Will that help your child stay calm and content? Maybe it is. I don't know. From my perspective, from what I've seen, that's not the case, because I've done childcare for many, many years, and then I switched to Montessori, and my entire way of thinking was changed. And I don't know what your experience is. I don't know what your background is. I don't know if you're in a classroom, and I don't know if you're homeschooling, but I'd love to know what your experience is, what your observation is, and if you've noticed any of these things to be true or false. So if you have a comment, if you have a question, leave it down below, because I would love to hear from you. I would love to get your perspective, and I would love to see research that supports or contradicts this in any way. So with that being said, we have finished chapter 16. Now, I didn't do the whole chapter. If you want to go back and read it, it's a great chapter. It's another short chapter. It's easy to read. So go back and read it for yourself. And don't forget, if you really like what I'm doing here, go over to my page and hit that subscribe button. I'm almost to 200. I really want to get to 200 by Christmas. So if you could help me do that, that would be great. And if you're interested in joining my community, I have a community over on my locals page. If you don't know what locals is, it's kind of like a Facebook alternative. I am at montessoriforeveryone.locals.com, and on locals, if you join my community over there at locals, it's just a page where I post my videos. I post any PDF I come up with, any information I want to share. I'll post it on my locals page. It's also a community where you can post things too. So if you have resources to share, if you have comments, if there are articles you're interested that you want to share with other people, sign up for my locals page and you can share resources there as well. So it's not just for me. It's not just for me to get information out to you. You can be part of the community and hand out information to anyone you want. So it's a great place. It's a great alternative if you're looking for an alternative to Facebook. There are other people over at locals, so feel free to explore. And with that being said, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.